So somewhere on Earth, there is supposedly this massive magical iron wall. And behind this wall, there are millions of these subterranean goblin-like creatures who literally spend every single day licking the metal.
Right, just licking it layer by layer.
Yeah, licking the iron, trying to break through and, destroy humanity. But, and here's the kicker, just when the wall gets paper thin, like right before they decide to finish the job the next morning, the wall just magically regenerates overnight back to its original thickness.
It is quite the image.
I mean, it sounds like a discarded draft of Lord of the Rings. It's wild. But for centuries, this specific folklore, the story of Dhul-Qarnayn and the wall of Gog and Magog, or Yajuj and Majuj in Arabic, has been treated by so many people as actual literal geographical history.
Yeah, and the persistence of that specific myth, it's actually a really perfect case study in how human beings, we just prefer a comforting, fantastical narrative over, complex reality.
Oh, 100%.
Because today we are talking about verses from Surah Al-Kahf in the Quran, specifically Ayat 83 through 102. And when you strip away centuries of all that mythological accumulation and you just examine the actual text, you find zero goblins, zero magic wands, and absolutely zero regenerating iron.
Okay, thank God.
Yeah, instead you find a highly, highly sophisticated treatise on statecraft, on metallurgical engineering, and really the sociology of civilizational collapse.
Okay, so let's unpack this
Yeah.
because if we have, satellite mapping of the entire globe today and we haven't found millions of goblins licking the wall anywhere, we clearly need a massive reality check here.
We really do.
And our source material for this deep dive today is a fascinating lecture by Allama G.A. Parwez. It's specifically lecture 6 out of 9 on Surah Al-Kahf. And Parwez built his whole analytical framework around taking these ancient texts completely out of the realm of fairy tales and placing them firmly into rational historical logistics.
Right. Our mission today is essentially to perform an intellectual autopsy on this text using Parwez's rationalist lens. Because understanding this narrative through the framework of ancient geopolitics, it changes everything for you as a listener.
It totally reframes it.
Exactly. It completely reframes how we look at the responsibilities of the superpower, the actual difference between exploitative imperialism and genuine international aid, and ultimately, the thermodynamic reality that all massive, globally dominant empires inevitably fall apart.
Right. So let's start by just identifying the main character here. The Quran refers to him as Dhul-Qarnayn. If we are completely throwing out the magic carpet version of the story, who was this person historically?
Well, the text itself uses a title rather than a proper noun, like Alexander or Ramses. In Arabic, the root word qarn carries a few different meanings. It can mean an era, a generation, or a literal physical horn.
Like on an animal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Dhul-Qarnayn translates directly to the two-horned one. And for generations, scholars speculated this might be Alexander the Great. But Parwez, and he aligns with several really rigorous modern historians on this, he points the evidence overwhelmingly towards Cyrus the Great,
Wow, okay.
the founder of the Achaemenid Empire in ancient Iran.
Wait, okay, I need to push back on that immediately because Cyrus the Great was a Persian emperor, right? He was a follower of Zoroastrianism.
He was, yeah.
So how do Islamic scholars reconcile a Persian Zoroastrian conqueror with a righteous figure being praised in a Quranic text? I mean, doesn't that fundamentally clash with the traditional religious boundaries people usually draw?
And that tension right there is exactly why Parwez's analytical framework is so vital. Because Parwez emphasizes that the Quranic standard for a righteous leader, it isn't about the specific, religious label they wear. It is about their adherence to universal permanent values.
Like justice and equity.
It's exactly justice, equity, and the protection of the vulnerable. And Cyrus the Great is celebrated historically precisely for this. When he conquered Babylon, he didn't slaughter the inhabitants like most ancient kings did. He actually freed enslaved populations, including the Jewish people, and he established what is basically an unprecedented code of human rights.
Which is pretty rare for the ancient world.
Oh, incredibly rare. And furthermore, the title, the Two-Horned One, perfectly aligns with Cyrus's specific geopolitical reality. He unified the two massive kingdoms of Media and Persia. And if you look at ancient iconography, rulers of this newly unified empire were literally depicted wearing headdresses that were adorned with two horns.
Oh, to symbolize that dual authority.
Exactly.
That is fascinating. So it's a physical symbol representing a geopolitical merger. So we have a real historical human emperor here. Which brings us to the quote-unquote monsters. If Yajuj and Majuj weren't, fire-breathing subterranean goblins, who exactly were these populations that terrorized the ancient world?
Well, let's look at the actual linguistics of the Arabic text. Parwez notes that the root word for Ya'juj is connected to the concept of blazing fire, or agitation, or severe restlessness.
Okay.
It describes something that flares up violently and just uncontrollably. And Majuj shares a very similar phonetic intensity. It implies something that surges like storm waves.
So it's descriptive, not literal.
Precisely. We are looking at normal human populations. Specifically, these were nomadic, highly undisciplined warring tribes. Historians generally map these groups to the Scythians, the Tartars, or the early Mongols, who originated from the really harsh terrains of the Central Asian steppes.
Geography really dictates economics here, right?
Yeah.
Because if you live on the Eurasian steppe, which is basically a massive, seemingly endless ocean of grass, you just cannot establish traditional agriculture.
You can't. The soil and the climate don't support large-scale farming.
Right, so your entire society has to be built around nomadic herding and extreme mobility, usually on horseback.
Consequently, when harsh winters hit, or when their resources dry up, those nomadic populations face literal starvation. So their primary economic imperative just becomes raiding. They raid the settled agricultural communities that border their territory.
Because that's where the food is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they were highly mobile cavalry forces. They would surge across the borders, loot the grain, steal the livestock, burn the settlements down, and then just vanish back into the steppes before any formal, slow-moving infantry could even mobilize to fight them.
It is the ultimate historical telephone effect in action. I mean, imagine being an agrarian village that has literally never seen a horse-mounted army before.
It would be terrifying.
Right. Suddenly, thousands of screaming warriors descend upon your town, moving with this unprecedented speed. They burn everything in sight, and then they just disappear. So over generations of trauma, the victims mythologize their attackers.
They absolutely do.
So they attacked like a blazing fire morphs into, they breathed fire. And they were relentless, they're unkillable monsters. The rapid horseback raids are basically just exaggerated into supernatural terrors.
And the psychological impact of those raids was so profound that the myth actually crossed cultural and linguistic borders. The early Greeks suffered from these exact northern incursions, and they referred to the tribes as Gog.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and as that term migrated into Hebrew and other Semitic languages, it evolved into Magog, eventually becoming the paired phrase Gog and Magog.
Which is how we end up with the giant statues of Gog and Magog in the Museum of London today, acting as these mythical guardians of the city. I mean, a terrifying geopolitical reality, nomadic raids on agricultural borders, mutated into a universal fairy tale.
He really is wild. So having grounded the characters in reality, Parwez shifts his focus to the actual mechanics of Dhul-Qarnayn's campaigns, because the traditional folklore often portrays his global journeys as if he were simply wishing himself from one end of the earth to the other, just resolving conflicts with a wave of his hand.
Like a literal magic carpet ride.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Parwez pulls us sharply back to the specific vocabulary of the Quran. There is this strategic phrase repeated throughout the narrative, fa'atba'tazaba.
Fa-ba-sa-ba.
Yes. And it translates roughly to, so he followed a path, or more accurately in Parwez's reading, he utilized the means and causes.
Okay, let's really drill down into that specific word, asbab, because that seems crucial.
It is the linchpin. Asbab encompasses the physical, geographic, economic, and technological causes required to achieve a specific outcome. Parwez argues that the Quran is laying down a fundamental law of scientific statecraft here.
So it's very grounded.
Extremely grounded. To manage a global superpower, you cannot rely on miracles or divine intervention to magically solve your logistical problems. You must engage the law of cause and effect. Dhul-Qarnayn had to establish supply lines. He had to organize infantry, secure water sources, manage translators, gather intelligence. He utilized the tangible means necessary to project state power.
Which completely strips away the magical thinking. If you want a secure border, you don't just pray for a magical shield to appear, right? You engineer a physical defense, and you staff it with a disciplined military. So, utilizing these asbab, Dhul-Qarnayn launches his geopolitical expansions. And the text first details his western campaign, stating he traveled to the setting place of the sun.
Geographically, this aligns perfectly with Cyrus's expansion toward Asia Minor. pushing all the way toward the shores of the Black Sea. And the Quran contains a very specific visual description here, noting that he found the sun setting in a murky or muddy spring.
And traditional commentators, taking this hyperliterally, sometimes argued that the sun physically sinks into a puddle of mud at the edge of a flat Earth, which is
Mathematically and geographically absurd.
Entirely absurd.
Parwez clarifies that this is just a precise description of an optical illusion. If you stand on the eastern shores of the Black Sea and you look westward at dusk, the water appears incredibly dark, almost muddy, due to its sheer depth and the specific light refraction at that time of day. As the sun dips below the horizon over that really dark expanse, the human eye literally perceives it as sinking into a murky spring. It is a poetic, observational description from the perspective of an observer standing right there on the coastline.
Which makes perfect sense because we use the exact same observational phrasing today when we say the sun went down. Even though we fully know the Earth rotated, we don't say the Earth rotated away from the sun.
Exactly.
So he reaches the Black Sea, which is the western edge of his theater of operations, and the text says he encounters a nation there.
He encounters a population that is described as rebellious or oppressive. And the narrative states that Dhul-Qarnayn is given authority over them, with the choice to either punish them or treat them with kindness. This is where his statecraft is truly tested.
Because he has absolute power in that moment.
He does. But he implements a strict, predictable framework of justice. He declares that whoever continues to oppress and act tyrannically will be punished, but whoever acts righteously and peacefully will receive good treatment and easy tasks.
But let me interrupt and play devil's advocate for you, the listener, right here. Isn't this just standard empire building? I mean, how is Dhul-Qarnayn offering amnesty any different from a Roman general or a British imperialist conquering a foreign land, setting up a colonial government and demanding compliance? Why is this framed as a righteous act of justice rather than just another flavor of, violent imperialism?
That is a great question. The distinction lies in ancient norms of conquest versus the actual establishment of universal law. In the ancient world, the standard operating procedure for conquering a rebellious city was absolute devastation.
Right, like the Assyrians.
Exactly. Slaughtering the military-aged males, enslaving the women and children, burning the agricultural infrastructure to the ground. It was purely extractive and punitive. But Dhul-Qarnayn introduces a system based on individual accountability, not collective punishment.
Oh, that is a huge difference.
It is massive.
Yeah.
He targets the oppressive leadership, the tyrants exploiting their own people, while offering the general population integration into an empire based on equitable laws. He isn't extracting their wealth to send back to his capital. He is stabilizing a highly chaotic region.
He literally replaces arbitrary violence with the rule of law. That provides a totally different context. Then the narrative shifts geographically. Having secured the West, he turns to the Eastern campaign, traveling toward regions like Balkh in modern-day eastern Iran or Afghanistan. And the text says he encountered a people who had no shelter from the sun.
Which is just a beautiful way to describe the nomadic tribes of the eastern deserts and steppes. Unlike the settled urban populations in the West, these tribes lived in open terrain without permanent architecture or natural fortifications like forests or mountains.
You were just out in the open.
Entirely exposed to the elements. Dhul-Qarnayn's objective here was to secure his eastern borders against the unstructured, chaotic raiding environment of those exposed plains.
So he is drawing the literal boundaries of his civilization. We have the West, we have the East. But the narrative pivot, the real core of Parwez's analysis, happens in the third expedition. This is where the story elevates from basic border security to an absolute masterclass in advanced state capacity and ethical international aid.
Dhul-Qarnayn mobilizes his technologically advanced forces and travels to a region situated between two massive mountains. Geographically, Parwez identifies this as the Caucasus Mountains, specifically the Dario Gorge.
Let's conceptualize that geography for a second. The Caucasus Mountains act as this sheer, massive continental wall between the vast Russian steppes to the north and the really fertile, wealthy lands of the Middle East to the south. But there is a flaw in the wall.
Right, a gap.
A narrow natural mountain pass. It is a severe geographical choke point.
And upon arriving at this choke point, Dhul-Qarnayn finds a vulnerable local population. The text explicitly points out that they could barely understand his language, which really highlights their severe isolation.
They are totally cut off.
They lack advanced technology, they lack military organization, and they are living in a state of absolute terror. because their territory happens to be the exact geographical pathway that Ya'juj and Ma'juj used to pour down from the steppes, bypassing the mountain range, to devastate the fertile lands below.
They are basically the collateral damage of geography. Through interpreters, this terrified population begs Dhul-Qarnayn for help. In Ayat 94, they make a desperate proposition. They essentially say, Ya'juj and Ma'juj are causing massive corruption in the land. Can we pay you a tribute? Can we pay you a heavy tax if you build a barrier between us and them?
Consider the modern geopolitical equivalent of that offer. You have a highly vulnerable, technologically inferior nation approaching a global superpower, begging for military protection, and offering to hand over a massive sum of their national wealth to secure it.
In modern geopolitics, that is the ultimate security grift. I mean, if this were a contemporary empire, the response would be swift and entirely self-serving. They would say, we will gladly protect you. But the cost wouldn't just be the upfront tribute. The superpower would trap the vulnerable nation in heavy, interest-bearing debt.
Absolutely.
Think of modern IMF structural adjustment loans or the classic imperial protection racket. The superpower builds a military base, they assume control of the trade routes, demand access to natural resources, and effectively strip the vulnerable nation of its political autonomy. The weak nation is saved from the raiders, sure, but they are now eternally subjugated by their quote-unquote savior.
Because modern empires thrive on creating permanent dependency. They really don't actually want the vulnerable nation to develop its own capacity for self-defense, because an independent nation cannot be easily exploited. But Dhul-Qarnayn's response in Ayat 95 completely shatters this imperialist paradigm.
It's so good.
He looks at their offer of immense wealth and says, what my sustainer has established me in is far better. He means that his empire is already economically secure and functioning on a foundation of justice. He outright rejects the tribute.
He literally turns down the blank check.
He turns it down. But crucially, he also doesn't just order his army to build the wall while the local population watches passively. If he did that, they would still feel completely helpless, cementing a psychological dependency on his military might. Instead, he issues a specific command. He says, just assist me with physical labor. He asks for their manpower.
The mechanism of this aid is just brilliant. He acts as the chief engineer and project manager. He brings the advanced industrial technology, the metallurgical science, and the organizational framework of a superpower, but he empowers the locals to physically build their own defense.
It is the absolute ultimate non-extractive model of international aid. He is teaching them industrial organization. He is teaching them engineering. By having them provide the labor, they take real ownership of the infrastructure. They are defending themselves without incurring crippling financial debt or sacrificing their sovereignty. He's using the immense power of the state to uplift a vulnerable population, not to consume them.
So let's examine the engineering itself, because Parwez dives into the actual mechanics of Ayat 96 to prove this wasn't magic. It was applied physics. Dhul-Qarnayn commands the laborers, bring me blocks of iron. He has them stack these massive iron blocks to fill the physical gap of the mountain pass. Then he orders them to blow on the fires until the iron is white hot.
Establishing a forge of that magnitude in a mountain gorge requires phenomenal logistics.
Right.
You need massive bellows to increase the oxygen flow. You need an incredible amount of fuel. They likely had to deforest the surrounding valleys just to create enough charcoal to bring the temperature of the iron up to a forging heat. But there's a really glaring engineering problem here. Any metallurgist will tell you that a pure iron wall exposed to the harsh, wet, freezing elements of a mountain pass is going to oxidize rapidly.
It would rust. The structural integrity would be eaten away by the elements within just a few generations. So, what is his solution? He tells them to bring molten copper to pour over the white-hot iron.
When molten copper is poured over heated iron, it seeps into all the crevices and binds the blocks together. But its primary function is protective. Copper does not rust. It develops a patina that shields the metal underneath.
To put that into a modern engineering analogy, it's the ancient equivalent of reinforced concrete. In modern construction, we use steel rebar inside concrete. The steel provides the immense tensile strength so the building doesn't snap under pressure, while the concrete protects the steel from moisture and the elements. Dhul-Qarnayn used the iron for structural unbreakable strength against the raiders, and the copper as the weatherproof casing.
A perfectly engineered bimetallic alloy barrier. The nomadic tribes, who are armed only with light cavalry weapons designed for speed, are suddenly faced with an impenetrable, smooth, rust-proof metallurgical monolith. They cannot scale it with horses, they cannot dig through solid rock and iron, and they cannot burn it down. The geographical threat is neutralized.
The local population is secure. They own the infrastructure they helped build, and they owe the superpower zero financial debt. Taking away the goblin folklore actually makes the story vastly more impressive. It becomes a blueprint for the highest ethical execution of state power.
It truly does.
But just as the wall is completed, the narrative in Ayat 98 and 99 takes a very somber, almost melancholic pivot.
Yeah, Dhul-Qarnayn and the local laborers are looking at this monumental industrial achievement. It must have looked practically indestructible. Yet, Dhul-Qarnayn refuses to boast. He doesn't claim he has engineered a permanent end to history. He says, "This is a mercy from my sustainer. But when the promise of my sustainer comes to pass, he will make it level with the ground. And the promise of my sustainer is ever true."
He openly acknowledges the thermodynamic expiry of his own creation.
Parwez interprets the promise of this sustainer through a deeply scientific lens. It is not some arbitrary, magical doomsday event. It is the divine, universal law of cause and effect. The laws of thermodynamics dictate that entropy increases. No physical structure is permanent.
Not even that one.
Even a highly advanced bimetallic wall will eventually succumb to erosion, tectonic shifts, or the eventual development of advanced weaponry like gunpowder. Dhul-Qarnayn understands that physical engineering provides only temporary security.
And as Parwez points out, if you traverse the passes of the Caucasus today, you do not gain a pristine, towering iron wall. You find ruins. You find massive boulders, traces of ancient fortifications, and rubble. The wall eventually did exactly what Dhul-Qarnayn predicted. It crumbled into dust. The law of cause and effect ran its inevitable course.
However, the physical crumbling of the wall is not the actual tragedy, Parwez highlights. The profound tragedy is what happens to the civilization behind the wall when they forget why it was built in the first place. This transitions Parwez's analysis from physical physics to social physics, specifically addressing Ayat 100 through 102.
Because how does an empire actually collapse, if not from the outside?
An empire's ultimate downfall rarely starts because its military isn't strong enough or its borders aren't big enough. The downfall initiates when the leadership, the elite class, suffers from a condition the Quran calls akina.
Ideological blindness.
Ideological blindness. It is a psychological veil over their intellect and their values. Akina occurs when a society becomes overwhelmingly obsessed with its material achievements, measuring greatness purely by the thickness of their defensive walls, the vastness of their GDP, or the lethality of their military technology. In this material obsession, they completely abandon the universal, permanent values that actually give a civilization sustainable life.
They forget the foundational ethics. They forget the strict justice, the refusal to exploit the weak, and the non-extractive aid that Dhul-Qarnayn actually demonstrated. They start believing the iron wall itself is the source of their greatness, rather than the ethical framework that motivated them to build the wall to protect the vulnerable.
And when that ethical framework vanishes and is replaced by material exploitation, the law of requital, the inevitable societal consequence of systemic injustice activates. Their massive industrial achievements are turned to dust by internal rot long before an external enemy breaks through.
Wow.
And Parwez provides a striking way to diagnose this ideological blindness. He contrasts civilizations that organize themselves around biological, ethno-nationalistic ties with civilizations bound by shared ideological principles, which in Quranic terminology is referred to as deen.
The conflict between biological ties and ideological ties. Let's explore the mechanics of that, because this cuts straight to the core of how humans organize societies. Why does Parwez argue that bloodlines and geography are so dangerous to use as a foundation?
Because shared DNA or shared geography offers literally no guarantee of shared ethics. Parwez uses a really powerful historical example from early Islamic history to demonstrate this. He points to the figure of Abu Lahab.
Abu Lahab was the Prophet Muhammad's own uncle. You cannot get a closely biological or geographical tie. They were both born into the absolute elite nobility of the Quraysh tribe in Mecca.
But despite sharing the exact same elite bloodline and cultural geography, Abu Lahab violently rejected the universal values the Prophet was establishing, values that demanded social equality, the dismantling of economic exploitation, and justice for the marginalized. Because of his ideological rebellion against those ethical principles, his biological connection was deemed entirely irrelevant. He was cast out of the ideological community.
And Parwez contrasts him with figures who possessed zero biological connection, like Salman the Persian and Bilal the Abyssinian.
Right, consider the societal matrix of ancient Arabia, which was entirely obsessed with tribal lineage and racial purity. Breaking that matrix was completely revolutionary. Salman was from a rival empire, speaking a different language. Bilal was from Africa, enslaved and stripped of all societal status. Biologically, geographically, culturally, they had absolutely no connection to the Quraysh nobility.
None at all.
Yet, ideologically, they fully aligned with the values of justice, human dignity, and the fundamental unity of mankind. Consequently, they were embraced as central, foundational figures of the new community. Their adherence to universal values completely superseded their biological origins.
So Parwez is establishing that a sustainable civilization must be built on a shared ethical ideology, not on shared DNA. Building an empire on the premise of ethno-nationalism or racial superiority guarantees that the society is suffering from akina. They are navigating completely blind to the laws of human sociology.
And Parwez extends this critique to our modern obsession with ancient history. He observes how modern nations frequently claim the ruins of oppressive empires as their cultural heritage, utilizing them as tools for nationalistic pride. He specifically references sites like Mohenjo-Daro, Taxila, and the colossal monuments of the Egyptian pharaohs.
These are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Entire tourism economies are built around them. Modern nations put these ruins on their currency and build their national identities around slogans like, "We are the proud descendants of the pharaohs," or "We are the heirs of the Indus Valley."
Parwez argues that deriving nationalistic pride from these specific ruins is a glaring symptom of modern ideological blindness. His reasoning is rooted in how the Quran treats these sites. The Quran explicitly preserves the historical memory of civilizations like the pharaohs or the ancient tribes of Ad and Tamud purely as warnings.
Only as warnings.
They're presented as clinical case studies of rebellious, highly advanced, yet deeply oppressive societies that prioritize massive material power over human dignity and were subsequently obliterated by the law of requital.
So, to look at a pyramid, a colossal tomb built by the grueling, exploited labor of an enslaved underclass for the glorification of a single tyrant, and say, "Look how incredibly great my ancestors were," is to fundamentally misread the data of history.
You are aligning your identity with the oppressors based merely on the accident of shared geography, while completely ignoring the universal values those oppressors violently violated. Parwez emphasizes that these ruins are not preserved as trophies for modern nationalism. They are preserved as monumental autopsies. You are supposed to study their catastrophic ethical failures to avoid repeating them.
This philosophical framework leads directly into Parwez's severe critique of the modern world order. Let me frame this clearly for you. We are examining Parwez's specific geopolitical analysis based on his interpretation of these Quranic principles. He applies this ancient lens to modern global alliances, and his conclusions are deeply unsettling.
They really are. Parwez posits that contemporary global alliances are fundamentally structurally flawed because they are constructed on the exact same metrics that guarantee civilizational collapse, meaning mutual exploitation, geopolitical self-interest, and ethno-nationalism, rather than universal human values. He directs a significant portion of this critique at institutions like the United Nations.
On paper, the UN is presented as the ultimate global alliance for peace and human rights. How does Parwez argue it fails the test of Dhul-Qarnayn's statecraft?
Parwez observes that the operational reality of the UN, particularly mechanisms like the Security Council veto, essentially allows superpowers to dictate global terms based entirely on their own economic or military self-interest.
Right.
It operates as an alliance of convenience and power consolidation. Nations frequently vote in blocs not out of an ethical commitment to justice, but due to backroom deals securing resource extraction, military base access, or trade dominance. The concept of a majority vote is frequently weaponized to legitimize the exploitation or neglect of weaker nations.
So returning to Dhul-Qarnayn, he utilized his superpower status to empower a vulnerable population without demanding tribute or subservience. But the modern model utilizes alliances to ensure vulnerable nations remain dependent and exploitable. Parwez also leverages this framework to critique ideologies like Zionism, correct?
It does. Parwez points to Zionism as a contemporary manifestation of the biological over ideological fallacy. He categorizes it as a form of racialism or ethno-nationalism, where the fundamental rights to a land, a state, or basic human dignity are inextricably tied to a specific biological lineage or ethnic identity, rather than being founded on universal equal rights for all human beings regardless of their background.
Okay, I see.
When any ideology dictates that a specific biological group is entitled to superior rights while marginalizing another, Parwez argues that this society has succumbed to akina. They have blinded themselves to the universal divine laws of human equality, and their structural foundation is inherently unstable.
Parwez uses a chilling metaphor to describe what happens when nations form these diplomatic alliances based on exploitative models. When world leaders smile for the cameras, shake hands at international summits, and sign treaties while systematically ignoring these universal laws, he says they are partaking in feasts in hell.
The visual of that metaphor is incredibly potent. I mean, they organize these grand, highly civilized diplomatic dinners. The politicians are dressed immaculately. The rhetoric is completely polished. The food is exquisite. But socially and spiritually, the entire enterprise is a burning wreckage. Because an alliance built on the exploitation of the weak cannot sustain itself indefinitely. The thermodynamic expiry that applied to the bimetallic iron wall applies equally to modern political structures. They're dining in the flames of their own inevitable destruction.
Let's try to ground this massive concept with an analogy. Imagine a group of ruthless billionaires pooling their resources to construct a state-of-the-art billion-dollar smart home. The architectural design is flawless. The internal technology is decades ahead of its time. The security systems are utterly impenetrable from the outside.
Sounds perfect so far.
But to cut corners and maximize their short-term profit margins, they decide to build this massive, incredibly heavy structure directly on top of a known sinkhole, on a foundation of quicksand.
The structural mechanics of that analogy map perfectly to Parwez's sociology.
The investors are standing inside the grand foyer, drinking expensive champagne, congratulating themselves on the thickness of their walls and the brilliance of their engineering, willfully ignoring the fact that the ground beneath them is actively giving way. The engineering might be perfect, but because the foundation, the permanent universal values of justice and equity is missing, the collapse isn't just a vague possibility, it is a mathematical thermodynamic inevitability. They are basically throwing a party inside a beautifully decorated tomb.
And that realization brings Parwez's lecture to its philosophical summit. We have journeyed from the physical engineering of an iron and copper wall to the social engineering of a civilization. Dhul-Qarnayn possessed the wisdom to know his wall would eventually fall, yet he engineered it anyway because protecting the vulnerable was the ethically required action in that exact moment.
He didn't build it for eternity, he built it for justice.
Exactly. Modern empires, stricken by ideological blindness, build their walls and draft their treaties, believing they have secured their dominance forever, completely oblivious to the rot consuming their foundations.
If physical engineering, massive wealth, and global military dominance are completely meaningless without being anchored in permanent values, it raises a terrifying, deeply personal question. I mean, how does an individual or a society measure whether their lifetime of intense hard work is actually building something sustainable? How do you know if you are acting as Dhul-Qarnayn, building a necessary ethical defense for the vulnerable, or if you are the modern empire, sweating, bleeding, and exhausting yourself to construct a massive illusion that the law of cause and effect is just going to turn to dust?
That profound question is exactly where the curtain is pulled back entirely. In the next part of this series, Lecture 7 out of 9, tackling the intense final verses of Surah Al-Kahf, Ayat 103 through 110, we are going to dissect the ultimate psychological tragedy.
I can't wait.
We will examine the individuals and the empires who waste their entire lives in destructive, futile actions, who exhaust themselves completely, all while operating under the absolute unshakable delusion that they're doing fantastic, meaningful work. We will perform the final ideological autopsy next time.
We started this deep dive exploring how human beings prefer the comforting myth over the complex reality. We want to believe in magical solutions or, in goblins licking an iron wall because it absolves us of the difficult work of understanding logistics, justice, and statecraft. We demythologize the wall today. We saw it for what it truly was, a temporary physical solution driven by a permanent, universal value. So, look at your own life. Look at the structures you spend all your time, energy, and anxiety fortifying. Before you evaluate the strength of your own walls, your career trajectory, your financial savings, your physical security, your social status, ask yourself, are they built with the molten copper of universal values, designed to serve and uplift? Or are they just heavy iron blocks resting on quicksand, waiting for the inevitable law of cause and effect to turn them back to dust?